So I'm going to talk to you today about effectiveness and perhaps a little bit about the humaneness of the culls that have been going on. And what I want you to remember, if you remember anything from this talk, is that actually we have pretty good ways of estimating the size of animal populations in the wild, and those work for badgers. And we have good ways of estimating the proportion of the population that is removed by culls. But those methods are not being widely used at the moment to estimate or to examine how effectively the culls are. So why am I talking about this? Why have I been asked to be here today? Well, I was a member of the independent expert panel on badgers, and I had done a little bit of work on badgers before, but I'd also worked on a large number of other species and addressed questions about management of those species using the types of data that can be collected for badgers and statistical methods that can be used and that I've been helping develop to actually estimate population sizes in the wild. And so our aim from the independent expert panel, we were appointed by DEFRA, and we consisted of a number of people with different expertises. And I believe I was asked to come in because of my background in wildlife population biology, in statistics and management of wild populations. So I'm a scientist, I'm professor of zoology at the University of Oxford, and I work on estimating population sizes of animals and on managing those animals. And so what we did initially as the independent expert panel is we thought about ways in which you could go out and you could estimate the size of a population of animals in the wild. And there are a range of ideas we thought about. And these range from estimating the population size based on some correlation in the landscape where you're measuring them. It might be the number of sets or what have you. And what you would do is you would go to an area and you would measure that feature of the landscape, perhaps a number of sets. You would try and come up with an independent estimate of population density, and you would put a correlation through there. And then what you could do is you could go out and you could survey the area. You could say, I've got this number of sets, this type of landscape feature, that's my predicted number of badgers. But we decided not to go down this route for a number of reasons. And first of all, those sorts of correlations are often rather noisy, so they're not particularly good at estimating population size. Other methods we considered would be to go out and actually survey for direct signs of badgers. So looking for spore and what have you, and try and scale those up. And there were various other things we considered, right the way down to something called capture, mark, recapture analyses. And capture, mark, recapture analyses are ways in which you're able to identify individual badgers, badger 1, badger 2, badger down to N here. And we can identify badgers using genetic methods. So if you take a hair sample, you're able to get a hair sample from a badger, you're able to genotype it, and you're able to say, this is a particular badger. And then what you do is you go out a number of times, and you try and survey, this has got moved along one, I don't know why, it should be back here, but you go out and you see which badgers you catch or you sample. And we put barbed wire hair traps out there where a badger would brush past it and pick up some hair. And you end up developing what's called a capture history. So in this case, DNA or hair was collected from badger 1 at time 1 and at time 3, but not at time 2. And what we know is because the badger was caught here and here, it must have been within the population then, but just was not captured. And you can use this information, you can use a 0 between ones to estimate the proportion of the population that you're actually capturing when you're out there doing these surveys. And when you've got that information, you can also use it to estimate not only the population size. Well, first of all, you work out a recapture rate, which is how often the proportion at which you capture animals in your population. But you can use that to measure all sorts of things, or to estimate all sorts of things, including the population size. Because there might be some badgers out there that have got a 0, a 0, and a 0, and you could use that information to say, well, what probability would you get of a badger being there and never being caught at all? And you can use that to scale up. And these capture mark recapture methods have been widely used by biologists, but the statistical methods that have been developed allow you to ask whether some animals are more likely to be captured than others. And that capture rate might vary in space, or it might vary in time, or it might vary by sex of the badger, or it might vary by age of the badger. So these methods have been very widely developed. And they've actually been very widely used. So not just in wildlife management, so ecology, to estimate the size of populations, but they've been used by the military. So in fact, some of the first development of these methods was devised to estimate the number of German tanks during the world wars, and you were able to record the number, written the serial number on tanks. You could use these mark recapture methods to estimate the number of tanks out there. They're used in medicine to estimate the number of drug users within a community. You look to see which individual drug users turn up at clinics, the rate at which they turn up, and you can use that information there. And there's a very large literature. This is just 4 books on my bookshelf, but there are lots and lots of statistical books out there. This is a very widely used and very powerful technique. So what we did is we selected the mark recapture method to try and estimate the population size in the trial cull areas. And it turned out, after our discussions, this was a relatively straightforward and easy decision to make. First of all, it's the best way to do it, and you can, if used properly, you can come up with unbiased estimates of the number of animals within a population, and you can also come up with how confident you are about those estimates. Secondly, we thought it would be very difficult to defend the use of other methods, given how much research had been done on producing or developing these powerful statistical tools and on using them. So what we did is, how were we going to sort of know which badger's which? We put out hair traps, and if a badger brushes past that hair trap, it pulls out a tuft of hair. We can then go and collect those tufts of hair, or DEFRA staff and to collect those tufts of hair, and they genotype them. And so you come up with a unique genotype for each badger, and then you do that on multiple nights, and you can construct your recapture history. And then we analyse those recapture histories using the mark recapture methods I've just explained about to correct for as many different variables as we could, and this allowed us to come up with an estimate of the population size. Now, the second step is to work out how effective the culls were. And we can actually do this in 2 ways with the data that we've got. So first of all, we could say how many badgers have been culled, and what proportion of our estimate of total population size is that. So we can take those 2 bits of information, the number that we know had been culled, either by shooting or cage trapping, and the total population size, so our estimate of the number of badgers out there. And that's going to give us the proportion of badgers culled. And the number we were told to aim for, or the hope was, that these trials would be able to reduce the population by 70% of what it was when we started. The second way we can do it is actually we could genotype those animals that are culled. So we could take a hair sample and we could genotype them. And then we could look to see which of those badgers had originally turned up in our initial approach to estimate the population size. So that gives us another estimate of the number of badgers that have been culled. And so this gives us an idea, and as far as we could tell, that this is the best way that we could come up with unbiased estimates of the proportion of badgers that were removed by the trial culls. And so what did we find out? We can have 95% certain that controlled shooting, so this is just the shooting side, not the cage trapping, removed less than 24.8% of the pre-cull badger population in Somerset and 37.1% of the population in Gloucestershire. So we're putting confidence on these numbers as well, so how certain we are, and our conclusion was that we were quite a way below the 70%. But as well as shooting, there was also a combination of shooting and cage trapping, And that increased the numbers, so we got up to 48.1% and 39.1%. So we're still significantly below the 70% target that had hoped to be achieved. And of course, that 70% target of the population pre-culling had been set by DEFRA given previous research that had gone on there. So unfortunately, in the first year of the cull, we hadn't reached the targets, but we are happy that the methods we used were appropriate methods and the best that were out there to try and come up with these numbers. So our conclusion from the independent expert panel was that the pilot culls were not effective in terms of reaching the 70% that was desired. We also concluded that the culls were not humane when we measured mean time to death with the targets that were agreed with DEFRA. I'm not going to talk about this now because I'm running out of time. I'm also not an expert on the humaneness side. My expertise is really with the effectiveness, but I thought I'd flag this. But what we could conclude, and what we did conclude, is that there are robust, reliable protocols to measure the efficiency and also the humaneness of culls. So the methods are out there. The tools are out there to do this properly. The IEP, having done this, we'd provided the tools and we'd provided the advice that DEFRA wanted. So we were disbanded. They knew the protocols. They were there and they were available. But we were quite surprised, I suspect, would be fair to say, that having spent quite a lot of time identifying the most powerful and the most robust methods out there, that the genetic capture mark recapture methods were not used. And I understand the reason for that was primarily financial, but I don't have any data to provide that now. And so the new ways, so what's happening now? Where are we now? Well, currently, if you go through the reports on the DEFRA website, a target is set, and confidence intervals, a target is set that would remove 70% of an estimate of the population size. But the methods that use to estimate this population size are based on these landscape features, so a method that the IEP rejected as not being effective. So the IEP said that we weren't going to use this method because it was not effective. But slightly, perhaps even slightly more surprising, other than using an admittedly cheaper, but more biased and less accurate and more uncertain method of estimating population size, is confidence intervals around the estimate were chosen. And what happened is DEFRA are now using the lower 95% confidence interval as their target, so the number of badgers to be removed. So for example, if you estimate a population size, you come up with a range of uncertainty with any other method, and that big blue dot is your best guess estimate, and the range here is that 95% of your estimates will range between these two dots here. And if you work with the bottom dot, and you say I'm going to estimate 70% of that, that may be significantly lower than the true 70% estimate. It's a slightly unusual way, statistically, of trying to set effectiveness, if I'm completely honest. So what I think's happened is the IEP considered these sets of methods, and we went for this one for very good and defendable reasons. But over time, we've been moving up, and we're now actually estimating, or the methods being used, we can't have a huge amount of faith that they're doing particularly well. And I think there's some evidence, that they're not doing particularly well, in that recently the cull targets have had to be reset in the areas where culling is going once culling has started. And that's because either the targets have been reached very, very quickly, which suggests that the number of badgers out there was higher than the estimate provided by these features on the landscape, or secondly, they were getting nowhere near the target, so there were not as many badgers as we might expect. And that's not particularly surprising, given that the methods that they're using are not particularly accurate. So my take on this is that if you want to estimate badger numbers accurately, and you want to estimate the proportion removed from the cull, from any cull, there are methods out there that can do it. they're not just developed for badgers. These are really widely used across the sciences. We have a really good understanding of these methods, of where biases and where uncertainties come in. And the IEP use those. They're not currently being used, and perhaps there's better things to spend money on. That's not my call. I'm just a scientific advisor. But at the moment, we're not using the best methods to estimate population size or badgers. So I think I'm going to stop there because I think I've run out of time, or close to running out of time. But thank you very much.